Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is dedicated to serious thinking for a serious church, and I'm Jordan Stefaniak, president of the London Lyceum. And in this episode today, we're going to cover the sufficiency of Scripture, which has been a matter of quite a bit of controversy over the last 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, plus probably longer than that. I mean, obviously it's been centuries of questions about this, but particularly in Protestant circles and the ones that I'm more familiar with, this has been something that has been more of a question than it previously had. But before I do that, I just want to remind you, click the little subscribe button and then hit the like button and go ahead and drop a comment below. Questions, thoughts, I mean, I'm happy. You disagree everything with what I say, drop a comment. I'd love to hear from you. If you like it, drop a comment. If you have questions or thoughts, drop a comment. I appreciate you guys watching and tuning in. It always surprises me a little bit that anybody actually wants to listen to anything that I say, but this is a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and get to work. Sufficiency of Scripture. According to the Reformed Confessions, Scripture is the only sufficient, certain, and infallible rule for all saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. I have written a not Together for the Gospel, the Gospel Coalition article, Canada, and I'm going to drop a link to it in the description below on this topic, and I'm going to follow it to some degree. I'll add in some comments, some commentary based on it, but if you've read that before, I'm going to be covering some of the main points there because I still like what I wrote there. Not often does that happen. Usually I'll write something and then as the time goes by, I think, man, I wish I could edit some of that stuff a little bit. And for the most part, I really like this one. So I'll drop this in the notes. I think what we want to think about what the sufficiency of Scripture means. Typically when you think sufficiency, you think things like you don't need anything else. You've got everything you need there. So let's go ahead and start with a few questions that I think helps prime the pump for thinking about this particular topic. So if I were to ask you, is Scripture sufficient for changing the oil on my GMC Sierra pickup truck? I think most of you would say, no, it's not. It's not sufficient for you to know how to change the oil on your pickup truck. It doesn't tell you where the oil filter is. It doesn't tell you what size of socket wrench that you need in order to get the cap off to get the oil out. It doesn't do any of those things. So in a sense, it's not sufficient for that. But no one really bats an eye at that. That's fine. We're cool with that. So ask about this, is Scripture sufficient for something like the law of non-contradiction? And I think most people would probably, somewhere in the middle, they'd probably say, well, I don't think it needs to be. The laws of logic aren't really things that Scripture is explicitly talking about. So maybe it's not sufficient to work through those. And maybe it is. Maybe they would say, well, here, let me give you an argument to show you that, logic comes from the nature of God, therefore X, Y, Z. But let's go ahead and ask a little bit more difficult question. Think ethical things like transhumanism. Is Scripture sufficient to address all the things that go on with transhumanism? And I think you're probably going to get a mixed reaction. Again, some people will say, yes, absolutely. People like Biblical Counseling Movement, I think, would say, yep, absolutely. We've got everything we need here in Scripture. Everything outside of it is unnecessary, unrelated, completely potentially useless. I don't know. I'm not in that movement, so you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. But just from the outside looking in, I would assume that they would say something along those lines. Because I guess, but then the other people would say, well, the Bible doesn't address all of the modern technological challenges we face. And it may give us some serious, clear guiding principles of how to handle it, but it doesn't give us all that we need to know and understand. And then finally, I think this question really gets at the heart of it. Is Scripture sufficient for us to understand the metaphysics of the incarnation? Again, this is still a little bit difficult because there's no verse in the Bible that explicitly says things like there's one person and two natures united indivisibly, inseparably in the hypostatic union. You don't see that sort of terminology in Scripture itself. So is it really sufficient for that? Are we allowed to say that Scripture is sufficient for this, and yet we're going to be taking things from external sources like ecumenical creeds, That really gets at some of the important questions that I think we need to think about and ask when we're thinking about the sufficiency of Scripture. So things like, number one, what does it mean for something to actually be in Scripture? And then number two, does the sufficiency of Scripture require all things exhaustively to be in Scripture? I think most agree, at least today, that the Bible doesn't contain an instruction manual for every single little thing that we may find, whether that's oil changes or whether that's I don't know, the radius of the Earth, how far down the core is, or something like that. But we find it a little bit more difficult to discern and think through these sort of topics when it comes to more properly biblical topics like the incarnation. And then you've got these like weird in-between ones like, I guess the popular stuff is social justice or whatever. I'm not even going to talk about that because I'm not interested in it. Well, I am, but not for this particular episode. And I don't want to make any... It seems like whatever you say, you're going to make people mad. So I'm just going to leave that alone. So what do we make of these sort of questions? Is Scripture sufficient for those various areas? I think it's helpful to remember how the Reformed confessions have talked about the sufficiency of Scripture. I really do. So let's take a look at something like the Second London Confession. You'll find this in chapter 1, in section 1. It says, "The Holy Scripture is the only sufficient, certain, and infallible rule for all saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. Although the light of nature and the works of creation and providence do so far manifest the goodness, wisdom, and power of God as to leave men inexcusable, yet they are not sufficient to give that knowledge of God and his will, which is necessary unto salvation." So, I think you see a couple of misconceptions from this text, I guess is the terminology for it. There's a lot of confusion over what it does mean and what it doesn't mean. And I think you find this confusion not just today, but also in ages past. Francis Turretin, you see him addressing some of the confusions that come from these sort of claims. Herman Bavinck, same exact sort of thing. So they actually, in their works, provide a laundry list of things that the sufficiency of Scripture doesn't mean, because people seem to take it in a lot of different ways. So like sufficiency, it doesn't mean that Scripture contains everything done or said by Christ even. I mean, Scripture itself affirms that. You go to John 20:30, it tells you that the Bible couldn't contain everything that Jesus said or did. Sufficiency of Scripture also doesn't mean that everything is taught word for word in Scripture. Many things are supposed to be deduced by inference. So you think of the incarnation, the two natures in one person, those sort of technological terminological aspects aren't just word for word in the Bible. You will never find anywhere that says one person, two natures. And that's not bad. That's not a denial of the sufficiency of Scripture. And there's another way sufficiency is misunderstood. It doesn't mean that it contains everything exhaustively related to the Christian faith, only that it contains matters that are necessary to salvation. So there's a lot of things that aren't considered articles of faith that just simply aren't there. And that's okay. That's not a denial of the sufficiency of Scripture to say that. Sufficiency of Scripture doesn't mean you have all possible knowledge, either word for word or implicitly. I mean, obviously, I think we agree it doesn't contain things like molecular biology in it, and that's fine. It doesn't need to. The Reformed tradition, I think, provides a lot of clarity here in what it does mean. And I think part of the reason the Reformers were able to properly locate the doctrine of sufficiency is because they sought to distinguish between various principles, epistemological principles. How do we know things about God? How do we understand his revelation? So they start with this first foundational epistemological principle, which is the Spirit of God himself. He's the ontological principle of all knowledge. He's the ultimate bedrock. And then you have below that, Scripture being the infallible external cognitive principle of knowledge. And then finally, there's that third subjective sort of principle where there's this internal cognitive principle where the Spirit is causing knowledge in us to be received, to be reflected on, to be confessed through various sources. The sufficiency of Scripture doesn't invalidate that third epistemological principle. Rational contemplation remains necessary. Rational contemplation in faith that is, that it's a necessary knowledge or necessary means for our knowledge. But this doesn't mean that either those first or second principles are invalidated. It doesn't mean that we don't test our faith ultimately by those first two principles. That doesn't mean that those aren't the foundation from which everything is built. It just means the Spirit himself is an ontological principle, and Scripture as infallible external cognitive principle fulfills those particular roles. But what does sufficiency mean? It means that we have a single, final, authoritative rule for all matters of saving faith, knowledge, and obedience. It's as simple as that. Unlike Roman Catholicism or other traditions, we don't have an incomplete revelation that needs alternative means to supplement its lack, to confirm its meaning, to explain what it actually is saying. It means Scripture is the norming norm for all saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. And I keep repeating that saving knowledge, faith, and obedience because that's what the confession says. I think that's critical to understand what it is sufficient for. Those things, saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. It's the final arbiter of truth. That's what it means, for all saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. As a sufficient rule, it means that nothing can supersede Scripture, right? If something disagrees with Scripture, it's clearly and absolutely wrong. As to sufficiency in its content, it means that Scripture is sufficient in a limited scope. So as I've repeatedly, Scripture is sufficient for what? All saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. Not non-saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. Not how to change the oil on my car. It's talking about a particular set of propositions in this case. So consider the confession one more time. In 2nd London Confession 1:6, it says, "The whole counsel of God concerning all things necessary for his own glory, man's salvation, faith, and life is either expressly set down or necessarily contained in Holy Scripture, unto which nothing at any time is to be added, whether by new revelation of the Spirit or traditions of men. Nevertheless, we acknowledge the inward illumination of the Spirit of God to be necessary for saving faith of such things as are revealed in the Word, and that there are some circumstances concerning the worship of God and government of the church, common to human action and societies, which are to be ordered by the light of nature and Christian prudence, according to the general rules of the Word, which are always to be observed." So the confession provides an answer to both the nature of sufficiency and the content of sufficiency. Let's take them in turn. The first question is, what do we mean by something being in the Bible? This is when we're thinking about the nature of sufficiency. As with most theology, the answer is not simplistic. Theology does require us to distinguish between various senses of sufficiency. And again, I think Turretin is a wonderful guide at this juncture. So he distinguishes between the substance of Scripture and the literal word-for-word sense of Scripture. He says only the actual words are absolutely contained in Scripture. But while many things are not recorded literally in the words of the Bible, they are contained in its form or its substance. Within the substance of Scripture, things are contained in them really, or they are not doctrines necessary to salvation or false and counterfeit doctrines. So I really like that terminology of substance and form, where in the Reformed confessional good and necessary consequence sort of terminology fits, or as 2nd London says, expressly set down or necessarily contained. These are consequences from Scripture. Some consequences are proximate, necessary, and plain, but others are remote, probable, and obscure. But the Reformed tradition has understood these to be in Scripture. Even if they require external philosophical contemplation, they would be considered inside of it. It is the wooden sense of in the Bible, the absolute word-for-word only approach that heretics have often used to twist the substantial meaning of Scripture while claiming to be following what the Bible teaches. You see this with the Eunomians in the early church and the Socinians in the Reformation. I mean, Turretin again is railing against them at length, arguing against them. He says this, "Our controversy here is with the Socinians, who deny the existence of any such natural theology or knowledge of God, and hold that what may appear to be such has flowed partly from tradition handed down from Adam, and partly from revelations made at different times. The Orthodox, on the contrary, uniformly teach that there is a natural theology, partly innate, derived from the book of conscience by means of common notions, and partly acquired, drawn from the book of creatures discursively. So, his problem with the Socinians is not new. It's not about restricting the knowledge of God. So his problem with the Socinians is restricting the knowledge of God, and it seems this problem is not new in any sense. Basil and Gregory of Nazianzus face a similar challenge themselves. I mean, Basil talks about his frustration with those critiquing the pro-Nicene arguments and theology. He says, since whatever the theologians seem to have recorded about the substance of God has been expressed in figurative language, or even in allegories, the words transport to us to other notions. Hence, if someone should contentiously stand by the mere letter, taking it in its obvious interpretation without duly examining it, he has strayed into the myths of the Jews and silly old wives' tales, and he will grow old in abject poverty, devoid of worthy concepts of God. And Gregory similarly calls these thinkers textual vandals. I love that use their simplistic notions to rob the written word of its sense. He argues in a similar fashion. He says, time and time again, someone repeats the argument about not being in the Bible. Yet we are dealing here not with a smuggled-in alien, but with something disclosed to the consciousness of men, past and present. The fact stands already proved by a host of people who have discussed the subject. All men who read the Holy Scriptures not in frivolous or cursory way, but with penetration, so that they saw inside the written text to its inner meaning. There's this constant refrain among the false teachers, and it is to show the express words or we cross them out as unscriptural. But Gregory argues that you cannot be dreadfully servile to the letter. There must be a place for biblical teaching that is implicitly, though not explicitly, located in the Bible. There must be a place for biblical teaching that is implicitly, though not explicitly, located in the Bible. Now, what about whether the sufficiency of Scripture requires all things exhaustively to be in Scripture? We haven't really covered that in depth quite yet. There are two related questions, I think, embedded in this one. First, does Scripture contain absolutely everything about the world? No, obviously not. It does not contain molecular biology. It doesn't contain a manual to change the oil on my truck. It doesn't contain a manual of how to get a toddler to take his nap in the afternoon. It doesn't give any of those things. The real question, though, I think that people ask is, does it contain everything that is helpful for Christians to know? Everything possible that could be good for theological purposes, I guess. It might seem anti-Protestant to suggest that there are useful truths in nature that are not found explicitly in Scripture. In this case, absolutely or word for word, as Turretin might say, or even implicitly, by good and necessary consequence in Scripture. But here again, I think the Reformed Protestants will surprise us. As the Second London Confession of Faith explicitly claims itself, there are some things that are ordered by the light of nature and Christian prudence. The sufficiency of Scripture is limited to saving faith, knowledge, and obedience. If you want to expand the sufficiency of Scripture beyond that, you go beyond the confession. You go beyond all of the Reformed confessions. And that's fine. If you want to do that, that's cool. We can be friends, whatever, but don't claim the Reformed mantle if you are unwilling to adhere to what the Reformed confession states. If you want to go beyond the confession for yourself, okay, but you cannot revise it or require other people to revise it or chastise other people for denying basic reformational principles or doctrines when they're just following the Reformed confessions. I think it's that modifier that's crucial, that saving piece again. It's not all knowledge, faith, and obedience related to the Christian faith in general. It's saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. And I think this is great news because God is infinite. If everything about him could be contained in a book, I would highly doubt that he'd be infinite anymore, right? As Gregory of Nazianzus once again reminds us, no one has yet discovered or shall ever discover what God is in his nature and essence. Now, the sufficiency of Scripture, I think it's a beautiful doctrine. I think we should uphold it and we should affirm it. Protestants should all affirm it. Roman Catholics should become Protestants and affirm it. It comforts us because we needn't worry that we're going to fail, because we will fail, and to have all knowledge of God. It's impossible to have every piece of knowledge and to obey him in everything. We continue to sin on this side of life. It encourages us, though, because we can grow in our faith without needing a multi-million-dollar library to have all saving faith, knowledge, and obedience. But the sufficiency of Scripture, this doctrine is liable to be abused like any other doctrine. It's liable to be misunderstood in both liberal and conservative ways. I know that's shocking, but it can be abused both ways. We can end up rejecting it, or can end up expanding it beyond its scope. The truth, though, of the matter is that the Bible is the only sufficient, certain, and infallible rule for all saving faith, knowledge, and obedience. But there do remain other uncertain, insufficient, and fallible subordinate rules of faith. So there are other things like creed or intuition or confession or other things that do serve as ministerial guides, though they are insufficient, though they are fallible, though they are uncertain, they can still serve as guides. So hopefully this was a decent overview and intro to what the sufficiency of Scripture means and what it doesn't mean. If you have thoughts, questions, ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. If there are other related topics you'd like me to discuss or talk about on this, let me know. I love hearing from you guys. I love interacting with you. So let me know in the comments below what you think, and we'll think together soon.